Well, let's stick on immigration for the moment. We've got a caller, Chris in Stockton-on-Tees. Hi, Chris.
Hello there.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it is a crying shame that we don't treat people as people. We treat them as numbers, and we don't look inside the packaging of the people. And our immigration policy against refugees doesn't see people as human beings, and that's the problem. That's the problem, and it needs...
Well, I hate to quote a number back at you, given your question, but 70 to 80% of asylum claims are approved. If you were right, then surely it would be 70 to 80% of them wouldn't be approved.
Yeah, but surely they at the end of the day, if you look at there's different policies depending on skin colour and all kinds of things. We need to look inside the packaging.
What do you mean, different policies related to skin colour?
Well, if you're coming from Afghanistan, you might come over in a boat. If you're coming from the Ukraine, you might not. You might come on a train.
Jackie, is that right, do you think?
I think there is an element of concern about how different groups
So I'm calling you
treated.
Jackie because
That's
that's on your
fine.
Twitter. I'm not being too familiar.
No, not at all. Everyone calls me Jackie, apart from my mum when she's annoyed and calls me Jacqueline.
I remember that.
Yeah, we do see. I mean, if you look at Windrush versus the treatment of people coming from Ukraine, I spoke to the Home Office last week to ask where is the scheme for Palestinians. Or we understand that a consultation is out to local authorities to see whether there's enough housing stock for there to be a scheme. But yet, that wasn't a criteria for Ukraine. The criteria was, let's have a scheme where members of the public open up their houses or their homes, and that's exactly what happened. I think it's we see it when you look at EU rights in terms of being able, and this is pre-Brexit, being able to bring spouses over or be saved from deportation, as opposed to, say, somebody from Jamaica. So race, unfortunately, and it's not something that, people like to dwell on, does seem to play a role in the deciding of immigration policy and its implementation. And I think the caller is correct, because although 70 to 80% of asylum claims are processed or are approved, often that is with an enormous amount of work done by lawyers who are effective and then in the appellate courts, not necessarily as a result of the policy. So it's not that long ago that we had same-sex couples. The policy there to question people about what they did and their habits and, which clubs they were aware of in the UK was just so intrusive and so wrong. The policies are a problem.
And I say this as a gay man.
Yes.
I mean, if you are seeking asylum on the basis that you're being treated badly because you're gay in your home country, I think surely the immigration system has to have a way of allowing you to prove that you are gay.
Yeah, but to ask people what they get up to in the privacy of their bedrooms, you don't ask heterosexual couples that.
But they're not making asylum claims on the basis that they're heterosexual.
No, but that's absolutely true. But the questioning was extremely, and I've sat through these interviews, extremely abhorrent. Particularly when some of the cases that I've sat through, people have had sufficient evidence, and the courts have gone on to say this, and I still do think the courts rule supreme, whether it's the Supreme Court or not. The courts have gone on to say, well, this was a mad decision because here was the evidence. You didn't need to go into that level of detail. And of course, now that doesn't happen anymore. But I think we can't, it's very difficult when you see the homes for Ukrainians and you don't see a homes for Afghan scheme. So, we've talked about this intractable problem of people coming over in the boats. And I said, there were 29,000 people last year. Over 9,000 of them were from Afghanistan. Now, we have legal and safe routes. We had the Arab scheme for people who worked with the British government, and we have the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, ACRIS. Hardly anyone has come on that scheme, so it doesn't work. And we do not want to see people risking their lives and coming across in boats. We had that awful tragedy just a few days ago, and we know the whole thing is predicated by some very evil operators, but unless we get hardly anybody, 29,000 people, unless the system works, people are still going to flee. If you're fleeing the Taliban, you are going to flee.
Belle, despite what our caller says there, Kristen Stockton, it is a numbers game, isn't it? Because if the economy needs a certain number of people in different sectors, so that by definition means it's a numbers game. When people see the annual immigration going up to 745,000 from sort of 200,000 or 300,000 just a few years ago.
And that's immigration overall?
Pardon?
That's immigration overall?
Yeah.
Right, okay, so a lot of these people are people that the government have specifically asked to come over to work in our public sector, and they're charged extortionate visa fees to do so. Their families are. Even those that work in the NHS are charged an NHS surcharge. It's not like they're not paying into the system. And then on top of that, they pay all these taxes as well, the same taxes that we pay. And, you know, they don't depend on the state in any way. So sometimes when the migration figures are come, the way in which they're given really paints, I think, the wrong view to the public. And even when it comes to those who are seeking asylum, guess who profits the most of people seeking asylum? A lot of those private companies that profited a lot from the pandemic, companies like Serco, all of these different companies that have huge contracts with the government to run the asylum state on their behalf. Either way, you know, the way in which it's posed, I think, is very, very wrong. And if we actually allowed people who do come here and who are allowed to claim asylum to work within 6 months, they could actually be paying back into the economy sooner because the vacancies are there. We just actually need to get people working rather than being dependent on the state and actually giving all of that money to these different private companies who are profiting rather than these people rebuilding their lives here.
Edward.
I think it's important not to conflate legal migration and I know the expression isn't very popular, illegal migrants or asylum seekers if you prefer it. I mean, any government has the capacity now, and no longer a member of the EU, to control legal migration, and there are a lot of advantages in migration, and there are some disadvantages. It's a balance that has to be achieved. As to the idea that there's discrimination in terms of those seeking asylum, I mean, we do have extremely able lawyers who represent people. We have a court system, and the courts can determine whether or not someone comes within the criteria that entitles them to asylum. So I don't think it's an arbitrary or an unfair system. But I mean, I'm not really quite sure what the alternative is. I mean, the image of people crossing the channel in boats is a very vivid one, whether it's the right-wing press that's responsible or indeed the left-wing press. And somebody has to do something about it. I'm not sure what the Labour Party policy is, but I'd be interested to know.
Do you know, I'm quite sure that the Home Office itself released a report not so long ago that said that there was racial discrimination within its within it, a lot of the policies that had come forward in the past.
And a historian said the same. Who the Home Office commissioned the Home Office.
So if the Home Office's own report says that, who are we to say different?
John.
So to start with the opening question, which we're just trying to address here, I mean, I would completely agree. It absolutely has to be right, doesn't it, that our immigration policy needs to be colourblind, and it needs to be. It needs to.
Do you believe it is?
And I think historically, in particular, it hasn't been. And I think one of the, to take a recent change, which I think has been a help. I'm not saying it's solved everything, but the points-based immigration system has meant that we are now taking best and the brightest from all parts of the world rather than it being free movement for people from Europe, which inevitably created a sort of natural colour imbalance about people who come into the UK. So I think that's a step in the right direction, but I'm certainly not claiming that we've fixed everything, because I'm sure there's more to do, and if it isn't on race, then there are other minorities that you need to watch out for. But I think that the follow-up point I'd also make is I don't think it is right to say that people are misled or unhappy or are wrong to be concerned about the numbers, the total numbers, legal and illegal. And Lord Fox is right to say that you've got to keep those two things separate in your brain. But I think repeatedly over the last 3, 4, 5 years, certainly since we voted to leave the EU, I think the voters have been really pretty clear that they want us to have control of our borders. And I think that one of the reasons why this is causing so much angst at the moment, not just in my party but more broadly, is because no matter what we seem to try, it's been very, very hard to exert that control and to say, well, we don't want all these people. We want some smaller number, which is, we hope, colourblind, etc., etc. That's the problem with it. The difficulty is that it's proven really difficult to create that control of our borders, and I don't think that. I think that that's a democratic mandate.
Had control of our borders?
When we were in the EU.
Yeah.
It was a completely different agreement. We had an agreement with the EU. We were part of the European Union and people could move freely. But even that was under a certain restriction. You meant to have a job here if you were coming to settle here. Yes, you could travel back and forth. And actually, we can still travel back and forth freely, I think for up to a period of 3 months. But to say that we had no control of who lived here, when even during that period of time, we did deport some people back to the EU, I think is completely wrong. And then to completely, again, conflate the numbers of people who are legal or so-called legal migrants, those who are economic migrants who have come to fulfill a job, and asylum seekers is completely wrong. And firstly, no one seeking asylum is illegal. That's where I think the government have got it completely wrong and are feeding the public the wrong information.
Well,
the word illegal
would you put any
is being
limitation
used
on immigration at all?
This idea that there has to be some sort of limit, I think, is ridiculous. As many people as we can welcome, and as many as we may need. I don't think the idea
that's open borders. No,
that's not open borders, and we've never had an open border policy. And I think it's really wrong to conflate it that way. And especially coming from a Conservative government who keeps saying, "Oh, we want to bring down numbers," but realising that they actually need more people in this country. The reality of the situation is to say we have open borders is wrong. We never have had.
No, I don't believe we do have. But the logical extent of your argument is that you think we should have.
No, I'm not saying that we should have completely.
What limit do you place, and how do you place it?
How do you place limits on people?
That's not the question I'm asking you.
No, I don't. No. What I'm saying is, how can you possibly place a limit? If you invited somebody over to come and live in our country, for example, on the basis that they were providing a particular skill, would you say to them, "Sorry, you can't bring your family because we've reached a particular number"? We're dealing, and that's I think what the caller Chris spoke to. We're dealing with human beings here, not numbers. And when the Conservative Party reduce it to numbers, this is where we get into a problem. You make people in the public believe that we can only fit a certain number of people in this country, that we can only provide
we can. I mean,
a certain number of people in this country. No.
We're not the size of Australia.
I mean, we can look.
Would it be 1 million a year, 2 million a year,
Well,
5 million a year? How many are
we
after?
don't know.
How do you think we need?
One at a time.
I don't think we know the answer to that, and I think perhaps some work can be done on that. But what we do know is that there's just over 1 million job vacancies in the labour market. Some industries would absolutely collapse. Last year I did a trafficking case, where Barbadians were brought in to pick strawberries and were living in slave-like conditions. The NHS would collapse. We've got visas for people working in arbiters. We've got care worker visas. I've got 3 care workers looking after my mother at the moment, and all of them are here on a care worker's visa. And the care agency, a massive agency that was used to employing British people, tell me they just cannot get anybody. So there is a crisis, and we have to have sensible debate about how we deal with that.
And reducing it to numbers is never going to be the way to move forward.
Okay.
If it was, the Conservatives probably would have been able to solve it by now with their really ridiculous limits that they keep on setting.
Right, well,